Imagine this. It's the summer of 1441. England is ruled by a young, sickly king, Henry VI, who has no children, and somewhere in the royal court, a horoscope is being drawn up. Not for fun, not for fashion. This horoscope predicts the king will fall dangerously ill, or worse, in July or August of that year, word gets out. Panic spreads through the king's council. They call in their own astrologers, and then they start asking, who commissions this prediction? Who wanted to know when the king would die? The answer leads them straight to one of the most powerful women in England, Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, wife of the king's uncle, the woman who, if Henry VI died without an heir, could very well have become queen. Was she a witch? Was she a traitor? Or was she simply a woman who stood in the wrong people's way? Welcome to Hannah's Royal Mysteries. I'm Hannah, and today we're going deep into one of the most dramatic cases of court magic, political conspiracy and gendered persecution in medieval English history. This is the story of Eleanor Cobham. Why Eleanor's fall was so catastrophic, you first need to understand how high she had risen and how unlikely that rise was. Eleanor Cobham was not born into the highest ranks of nobility. She came from a gentry family, respectable enough, but nothing close to royalty. Her route into the inner circles of English power came through service. She was a lady-in-waiting to Jacqueline of Annulled, who was at the time married to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Now, Humphrey. Let's talk about him for a second, because he is crucial to this whole story. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was the younger brother of King Henry V. Yes, that's King Henry V, the one who won Agincourt, which meant that Humphrey was the uncle of the current king, Henry VI. Henry VI became king when he was just 9 months old in 1422. He was young, he was considered weak, and this is the key detail, he had no children, which meant that for a significant stretch of the late 1430s and into the 1440s, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was the heir presumptive to the English throne. And Eleanor? Well, she became his mistress. Then, after Humphrey's marriage to Jacqueline was annulled in 1428, she became his wife, just like that. Through love, luck, and almost certainly a great deal of personal ambition, Eleanor Cobham, daughter of a Kentish knight, became the Duchess of Gloucester, the wife of the heir to the throne. Critics weren't kind. Eleanor's elevation was seen as scandalous by many at court. She was viewed as an ambitious commoner who had risen too high, too fast. And that kind of resentment has a way of festering, especially when the woman in question is one well-placed death away from wearing a crown. Now, that context matters enormously because when accusations of witchcraft and dark magic eventually came for Eleanor, they didn't come out of nowhere. They came from a world that already resented her position, already questioned her right, and was looking for a way to bring her down. Before we get to the accusations themselves, I want to take a moment to set the scene, because if you imagine Eleanor practicing witchcraft in some shadowy tower, then you're a little bit off the mark. The reality of what we'd call magic at the 15th century court is far more interesting and far more complicated than that. Court astrology was not fringe. It was not the province of outcasts or eccentrics. Horoscopes were actually cast for kings, for wars, for births. Educated men, clerics, scholars, physicians engaged with astrology as a serious intellectual discipline. The line between what we'd call science and what we'd call magic was essentially non-existent. Eleanor's social circle reflected exactly that world. She moved in a world where men like Thomas Southwell, a physician and a canon of St Stephen's Chapel, Westminster no less, and Roger Bolingbroke, a noted scholar and astrologer, were perfectly normal companions for a duchess. These weren't fringe figures, they were educated professionals. But there was a line, and that line was drawn around the king. Astrology that predicted a king's death, or worse, that was interpreted as an attempt to hasten it, crossed into territory that the church and the crown considered not just dangerous, but diabolical. To dabble in the future of royal bodies was to dabble in the divine order itself. And then there's the other strand of Eleanor's magical world, and this is where things get really fascinating. Alongside the learned astrologers, Eleanor was also consulting Marjorie Jourdain. Marjorie Jourdain was not a court scholar. She was a wise woman from next Westminster. She was what we might call a cunning woman or a village herbalist. She had already been in trouble with the authorities before Eleanor's case. She'd been arrested in 1430 for sorcery and had to pledge to give up her practices. Eleanor later admitted under questioning that she had obtained potions from Marjorie, but she was careful about how she describes them. She said they were meant to help her conceive, to have borne a child by her lord, the Duke of Gloucester. Love potions, fertility charms, in Eleanor's telling, this was the magic of a woman who desperately wanted a child with her husband. Private, domestic, entirely understandable. But here's the thing about magic in medieval England. It was a commodity. Spells, talismans and potions were bought and sold. Much of it existed alongside orthodox religious practice rather than against it. Prayers and amulets, saints and charms, this wasn't the satanic witchcraft of later imagination. It was actually just woven into everyday life. What transforms ordinary magic into criminal magic in this world is intent and target. And the moment Eleanor's name was attached to a horoscope about the king's death, all of her magical activities were suddenly reinterpreted through a very different lens. So let's talk about this horoscope, because this is where the story goes from interesting medieval history to genuinely jaw-dropping. In 1440 or 41, Eleanor's associates Thomas Southwell and Roger Bolingbroke produced a horoscope, and what this horoscope predicted, or what was said to predict, was that Henry VI would face a life-threatening illness or death in July or August of 1441. Let's just think about what that means for a moment, okay? The heir presumptive's wife, the woman who stood to become queen if Henry died, had allegedly commissioned a prediction of exactly when the king might die. Now, if you wanted to design the most politically toxic document possible, you'd be hard-pressed to do better than that. When rumours of the prediction reached the King's Council, they were alarmed enough to consult their own astrologers, who apparently denied seeing any such ominous future in the stars. That contradiction only deepened the suspicion. If Southwell and Bolingbroke were seeing deaths where others weren't, was it because they were using darker arts to see it, or to cause it? Southwell and Bolingbroke were arrested. The charge was treasonable necromancy, a phrase that I think deserves a moment's reflection because it tells you everything about how seriously the crown took this. Necromancy in the medieval sense didn't just mean rising the dead, it meant ritual magic that called upon spiritual forces, and the implication was that those forces were demonic. To use such magic in a way that might affect the king's life was, by definition, treason. Under pressure, and we should be clear that pressure in the 15th century could mean a great deal of things. Bolingbroke implicated Eleanor. He said she had first stirred him to make the inquiry, that she had wanted to know to what estate she should come. In other words, she had asked whether she might become queen. Oh girl, it's not looking good for you. Is it giving anybody else Dead Men's Shoes vibes?
Hello, this is Future Hannah. I'm actually in the editing process right now, and although I agree with what I said in the video, I did also have a bit of a thought. Could she actually be saying, you know, tell me what state am I going to become? Could she actually be asking, am I going to get pregnant? Like, I think that's a totally valid angle that I've obviously overlooked. And I think in the process of writing, researching, filming, I was so toned into the she wants to be queen angle. I think I overlooked that possibility, which I think could be more likely. But I mean, it's still linked anyway, because if her and Humphrey had stayed together and had a child, and Henry VI didn't have a child, that still could have happened. But yeah, anyway, back to the video.
That single statement to what a state she should come was devastating, because it confirmed what everybody already suspected. Eleanor wasn't just dabbling in astrology, she was imagining a future in which Henry VI was dead and she was queen. And imagining that future, it was argued, was as good as plotting it. Eleanor's response was to flee to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Sanctuary was a legal protection. Inside a church, the secular courts couldn't touch her. And it brought her time. But it didn't save her. Because while she was sheltered from the secular courts, the church had its own jurisdiction over matters of heresy and sorcery. A panel of bishops, headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, was convened to examine her. Eleanor's trial, or rather her examination, is one of the most fascinating documents of the period, because you can see, even through the formal language, a woman trying desperately to navigate an impossible situation. She denied most of the charges, the accusations of witchcraft, heresy and treason. Not guilty, and not guilty. But she did admit to Marjorie Jourdain and the potions, and she was careful, very careful, about how she framed that admission. These were fertility potions, love potions, the magic of a wife who wanted to give her husband an heir, not magic of a traitor trying to kill a king. It's worth pausing here and asking, do we actually believe her? Is it possible that Eleanor genuinely was just consulting a wise woman for help conceiving, and that her involvement with Southwell and Bolingbroke's horoscope was innocent curiosity, not conspiracy? Historians have wrestled with this. Scholar Hilary Carey and others have argued that the harmful magic element of Eleanor's case was essentially the horoscope itself, that predicting the king's death was interpreted as an attempt to bring it about, or, at minimum, as invoking demonic forces to peer into divine providence. In other words, the line between asking what will happen and trying to make it happen was almost impossibly thin. When the subject was the king's death and the person asking stood to inherit the crown. And that's the question at the heart of this whole case, really. At what point does curiosity become criminal intent? And at what point does asking a question become treason? For Eleanor, the answer was the moment her name was attached to that horoscope. By late 1441, the verdicts were in. And if you want to understand how medieval justice worked and how class shaped everything, even in the darkest moments, we need to look at what happened to each of the people caught up in this case. Roger Bolingbroke, the astrologer who had cooperated with the prosecution and named Eleanor as his instigator, was hanged, drawn and quartered. Thomas Southwell died in the Tower of London before his execution could be carried out. Marjorie Jourdain, the wise woman, the cunning woman, the woman who had already been warned once about her magical activities, was burned at the stake on the 27th of October 1441. This poor woman was burned at the stake for a crime of allegedly providing fertility potions to a duchess. And Eleanor, Duchess of Gloucester, the woman at the centre of the entire alleged conspiracy, received a very different kind of justice. She was required to perform public penance. 3 times she walked through the streets of London barefoot, carrying a lit candle, to present offerings at major city churches. This was a deliberate, calculated humiliation. You don't do this to someone whose guilt you want to quietly erase. You do it to make a spectacle of their fall. Picture that scene for a moment. A woman who had attended court in silks and jewels, who had dined with kings and commanded servants, walking barefoot on the cold November cobblestones of London, while the citizens watched. The choreography of public shaming.
People didn't see the kings and their lords very often, except when they passed by in their incredibly lavish outfits. The splendor of them, the way they glittered, helped them rule because it overawed the populace. When you take all of that away from a queen like Cersei, who up to then has only been seen by her subjects as this incredibly beautiful woman attended by maids and protected by knights, it's a way to strip her of all of the power that attends to her majesty.
Shame. Shame. Shame.
Cersei is not beloved in the streets of King's Landing. This is a woman who you dare not contradict, or she could have your tongue torn out. And now people are calling her filthy names and accusations, and they're free to do so. It changes the entire public perception of her, and that is obviously part of the intent. Indeed, she goes out defiant, but she's broken and damaged by the end of it.
Her marriage to Humphrey was annulled. She was stripped of her title as Duchess of Gloucester, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment, to be held in a series of royal castles, Chester, Kenilworth, and others. But here's where the class distinction becomes almost surreal. Despite the life sentence, Eleanor received appropriate accommodation. She was given a royal pension of 100 marks a year. She was kept comfortable. Punished, yes. Disgraced, absolutely. But not tortured, not executed, not burned alive. As mentioned, Marjorie Jourdemain was burned at the stake for providing potions Eleanor admitted asking for. Eleanor was given an allowance and a comfortable castle. Medieval justice, it was very much about who you were, even when it was punishing you. Okay, so I want to make a case, because this is where the story goes from medieval witch trial to something that feels uncomfortably modern. Eleanor's case didn't unfold in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of one of the most ferocious factional struggles at the English court in decades. On one side, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, popular, charismatic, the king's uncle and heir, and on the other side, Cardinal Henry Beaufort and William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who had their own vision of how England should be governed and who found Humphrey's influence deeply inconvenient. Bringing Eleanor down was a way to bring Humphrey down. Once his wife was publicly disgraced as a traitorous witch, once that label had been attached to his household, his own political standing collapsed. The heir presumptive's wife had tried to magic the king to death. How could anyone trust Humphrey after that? And the endgame? Well, in 1447, just 6 years after Eleanor's trial, Humphrey himself was arrested on suspicion of treason. He died in custody shortly afterwards. His enemies had finally finished the job. Eleanor's case is not unique in this sense. When you look at other noblewomen accused of witchcraft in this period, so Joan of Navarre, stepmother of Henry V, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, mother of Elizabeth Woodville, you notice a pattern. the accusations tend to cluster around women whose husbands or families are inconveniently close to the throne, or who are blocking someone else's political ambitions. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. Accusing a woman of witchcraft in the 15th century was, in certain circumstances, the perfect political weapon. It was almost impossible to disprove. It drew on pre-existing suspicion of ambitious women. It exploited the genuine fear, widespread and sincere, that dark forces could be directed against the king. And it bypassed the need for any concrete evidence of actual treason, because the accusation itself was the message. Was Eleanor curious about whether she might one day be queen? Almost certainly. She did consult astrologers and a wise woman. She admitted it herself. Was any of this actually a plot to kill Henry VI, though? That is a very different question, and it's one that her accusers had no interest in answering at all. Here's something that doesn't often get mentioned in tellings of Eleanor's story, but I find it as one of the most striking details of the whole case. Eleanor's trial prompted Parliament to change the law, specifically because Eleanor had initially sought refuge in sanctuary and was therefore examined by the church rather than the secular courts. Her case exposed a gap. The existing legal framework didn't handle noblewomen accused of sorcery very well. So, Parliament moved to close that gap. New legislation made it possible for noblewomen to be judged in the secular courts for treason and sorcery in future. A woman is put on trial partly through the exploitation of legal loopholes, and the response is to pass laws that make it easier to put women like her on trial in the future. If you wanted an example of how a single case could reshape the legal landscape and not in any way benefit that woman, well, you couldn't do better than that, could you? There's a grim irony noted here. Eleanor's case pushed criminal law towards a kind of gender equality in treason prosecutions. Just one more thing before we wrap up, because I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention this. Eleanor Cobham appears in Shakespeare, in Henry VI Part 2. Eleanor is a significant character, and Shakespeare doesn't treat her kindly, but he does treat her compellingly. He shows her ambition openly, has her commissioning the prophecy, and depicts her public penance in detail. There's a scene where she walks through the streets in a white sheet with a paper crown, the medieval mark of the penitent, while her husband watches powerless. It's theatrical, of course. Shakespeare always is, but the core of it is historically grounded. The public penance really happened. The political destruction of Humphrey really followed. The staging of Eleanor's humiliation as a way of humiliating Humphrey, that's not Shakespeare's invention. That was the point. And that's what makes Eleanor's story so durable. It has everything: ambition, magic, political conspiracy, public shaming, class injustice. It's a story about what happens to women who want too much, or rather, about what happens when the people around them decide that they want too much. So, Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, convicted traitor and sorceress, political casualty, footnote to history, or, depending on how you look at it, a mirror that reflects some of the very uncomfortable truths about power and gender, and the uses of fear. Was she a witch? By any meaningful modern definition, no. She consulted astrologers, but then so did everyone else at court. She obtained potions from a wise woman, as did many noble women seeking help with fertility. She asked, perhaps unwisely, perhaps recklessly, about her own future. But she didn't kill anyone. She didn't poison the king. The worst thing she arguably did was to exist in close proximity to the throne, and to be the kind of woman, ambitious, elevated, foreign to the role she occupied, that made powerful men nervous. And that horoscope, that prediction that Henry VI would fall gravely ill in July or August of 1441, he lived until 1471. That's 3 decades later. He was eventually murdered in the Tower of London, not by magic, but by the House of York. Eleanor spent the rest of her life in castle after castle, living on her royal pension, growing old in comfortable captivity. She died in 1452, having outlived most of the people who brought her down. Humphrey was dead, Cardinal Beaufort was dead. The political world that had destroyed her had already started destroying itself. She never became queen, but she never stopped being interesting. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to go deeper on any of this, the world of medieval court magic, the political intrigues of Henry VI's court, or the other women who face similar accusations, then let me know in the comments down below. I do have obviously similar videos, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and if you want more biographical content, then you can go check out my sister channel, which is obviously Hannah's Royal Histories. Until next one, guys, have a wonderful day.